Three, two, one.
Today is July 7th, 2024. We are interviewing Dieter Gruen. My name is Esther Finder. Mr. Gruen is in Downers Grove, Illinois. I am in Henderson, Nevada, in the United States, and the language will be English.
Thank you. Esther, I'm going to cut. Three, two, one.
Thank you for speaking with us today. What is your name, sir, and can you please spell it?
Dieter Martin Gruen. Dieter Martin Gruen.
Was this your name at birth?
No,
What was your name at birth?
Dietrich Grünstein.
Can I ask you to spell that also?
Dietrich umlaut Nstein.
Where were you born?
In Waldorf, Germany.
And when were you born?
November 21st, 1922.
And how old are you today?
101.
Did your family have a long history in Germany? Had they been there for many generations?
Yes, they have.
Has your family or anybody in your family served in the German military?
Yes, they did.
Can you tell us who and what service they performed?
My father served in World War I in the German army, and he was a lieutenant in the infantry. He served for 2 years in France and 2 years in Russia.
Was his service honored?
He received the Iron Cross.
Can you tell us his name, please?
His name was Joseph Grünstein.
What did he do for a living?
He was a school principal and also an official in the Jewish synagogue.
What does that mean, an official in the synagogue?
Well, he performed cantorial services. He taught in the Hebrew school.
And your mother's name?
Meta Grünstein.
And what work did she do?
In Germany, she was a mother, a wife, a housewife. Yes.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I had one brother,
And his name?
Herbert.
What are some of your early memories of your childhood in Germany?
Well, I grew up in a loving family environment, and had friends, neighborhood children as playmates, and started going to school at the school where my father was principal. When I came home from my first day in school, I received the Zuckertüte. That's a cone filled with candies. And so my recollections of my early years were very pleasant.
What do you remember from your early childhood about the relations between Jews and non-Jews in your community? Did you have Jewish friends and non-Jewish friends?
I had both Jewish friends and non-Jewish friends. At my very earliest recollections of birthdays, there were non-Jewish friends and Jewish friends in attendance. So there was no difference in those days. This was in the 20s, 1920s, yes.
What language or languages were spoken in your home?
German, just German. We spoke only German in our home, yes.
What religious traditions did your family observe?
My family was what today would be called German Reform, which was more like American conservative, verging on Orthodox, but not ultra-Orthodox. But we were very observant, observed all of the holidays and fast days, and were very much very observant, kept kosher in the home.
Did you have a favorite holiday?
Well, holidays are very much geared, many of them, to children. Hanukkah, Purim, yes.
What other childhood memories do you have? What did you do for fun?
I was a great fan of roller coasters. I was given a roller coaster by an aunt, sister of my father's, for my 5th birthday. And I loved to take it to the top of a hill in the neighborhood where there was a Lutheran church from the Middle Ages. And it was a rather steep hill, and I would ride it to the bottom of the hill at the highest possible speed. And the lady in the house at the bottom of the hill told my mother that I was going to break my neck. But I didn't.
I'd like you to kind of walk me through some of the changes starting around 1933 when Hitler came to power. What do you remember about these changes?
Well, my father was engaged to perform his cantorial services for a larger Jewish community in a town called Meiningen, which was a princely abode before World War I, and we moved from the village of Waldorf to this town of perhaps 20,000 inhabitants, which was sort of a provincial capital, in 1929. And I switched primary school from this school in Waldorf to the Prinz Friedrich Schule in Meiningen, primary school. So this was a larger school, and we occupied a home across a river that can be reached by a bridge, just a few minutes walk away. And I continued studies there. Until I was 10 years old. And that was a good experience. I made new friends, both non-Jewish and Jewish, and we lived a quiet, comfortable life in this town of Meiningen. So the transition was with my family and with my brother and parents, and it was just a more stimulating environment because it presented more cultural opportunities.
So you brought us up to about 1932, 1933. How did things start to change?
Well, it is common knowledge that in the election of 1932, the Nazis gained considerable political power, but did not receive the majority of the vote. But they had gained many seats in the Reichstag. In Berlin, and the German Constitution required that the president, Hindenburg, who was re-elected, appoint a chancellor. And he wanted to appoint a man by the name of Fritz von Papen. And Hitler insisted that he be appointed chancellor. So Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor. And then a few weeks after that, Hindenburg died, and Hitler assumed both the he was chancellor, but he took the presidency. He, without any consultation, he became both president and chancellor, and essentially began to exercise dictatorial powers. And the first law that he passed after assuming this total power, he could dictate to the Reichstag what he wanted. And the first law, as I recall, or one of the first laws, was that no Jew could hold a federal position. That is, he could not be an employee of the German federal government. And so both my father and Albert Einstein lost their jobs at the same time, because Einstein was professor at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. My father was principal of a school, but all schools in Germany, at least at that time, were federal institutions. And all teachers in all schools all over Germany were federal employees, quite different from this country. And so my father lost his position as principal of this school from one day to the next. Yes, that's what happened to my family. And of course, we all know and have seen pictures of the boycotts of Jewish businesses. That also occurred in the town in which I lived. And the attitude of people toward Jews changed almost overnight.
And around this time, you were turning 13. Did you have a bar mitzvah?
I had a bar mitzvah, yes, in the synagogue in Meiningen, and we lived in a house that was next to the synagogue, and we had friends and relatives to help me celebrate my bar mitzvah in the synagogue, and I remember some of the presents that I received at that time. A typewriter, for example. Yes, and I remember that occasion very well.
You mentioned that your father lost his job as a federal employee. How did your family sustain itself?
Well, it became difficult. He still had a small income from the Jewish community, but my father and mother decided to, for example, provide a home for several Jewish young people who lived in smaller communities where the anti-Semitism was more severe than it was in Meiningen, and who found refuge in our home, and they provided a small amount of additional income, but our circumstances were straightened as a result of this happening. Yes.
Or did they think it would pass? What was going on in your home?
Well, it became clear to me that just about that time, I changed schools from the primary school to the Gymnasium Bernhardinum. The Gymnasium is a school that prepares students for professional careers. Medicine, law, science, other careers, and is an institution that you attend for 8 or 9 years. And it's a very strict classical education. You begin with Latin, and after, I think, 4 years of Latin study, you can add another classical language like Greek or Hebrew. You could choose to learn either Greek or Hebrew as an additional language. But the choice of Hebrew was discontinued very quickly. And it became, I started violin lessons about that time. And my father bought a very, very nice violin, German made, that I still have, but don't play at all. But I have it. And I became a member of the school orchestra. We played, you know, classical music and gave performances for parents, and I was part of that. And pretty soon, our teacher, we had the same teacher for all the classes, and pretty soon he appeared every day in a Hitler uniform. And several of the students would appear in Hitler uniforms, Hitlerjugend. And at the beginning of the day, everyone would have to rise and give the Heil Hitler salute. And that became eventually, well, I would say beginning a year or two after Hitler came to power, that this took on personal animosities where I would take my violin out, get ready to play at a performance of our symphony, and I couldn't get a tone out because my fellow students had put soap on my violin strings. And then they would beat me up after school. So I could no longer attend school. This was maybe 1936, 35, 36. My brother, who was also at the gymnasium, my brother was 8 years older than I, and he was nearing the end of his gymnasium schooling. He told my parents that he could no longer live this way, and he went to England, to London, to University College in London to study. About 1936, around that period. So he left our home and went to London to study. And my grandmother, on my mother's side, who was the great-granddaughter of a rabbi and had one sister who had emigrated to the United States around 1910, before World War I. with her husband and her family. And at that time, 1936, was living with her daughter in Little Rock, Arkansas. So my grandmother's sister, and my grandmother had stayed in contact, very close contact, correspondence by letter for 25 years, ever since she left. They were very devoted to each other. And my grandmother wrote to her sister, would it be possible for me to go to the United States and live with them? And my uncle, that is, not a real uncle, but her daughter's husband had a business in Little Rock, and he agreed to sponsor me. And so I was able to obtain a visa under the immigration quota of 1937, which I believe was sort of on the order of 20,000 people from Germany could qualify for a visa if they had a sponsor in this country. So I was able to get a visa from this family. Their name was Rubenstein, Charles and Hetty Rubenstein, in Little Rock, Arkansas. And that enabled me to come to this country.
Did your parents consider any options for their own departure from Germany?
Well, that's a very, very interesting story, because I came to this country along with my older brother, Herbert. We both came together in August of 1937, and we traveled on a Cunard White Star liner by the name of HMS Georgic, a 25,000-ton British cruiser that cruised the Atlantic. She was sunk during World War II, but we made it to New York in August of 1937. And my brother stayed in New York. He had a visa from other relatives who lived in New York. And he stayed in New York and got a job in New York. And I went by train from New York to Little Rock, Arkansas. And so I was very fortunate not to be caught there, but you asked about my father and mother. they now had two sons. Their two sons were now in the United States. And they came and visited us the following year, in 1938. They came on a visitor's visa. And they visited both my brother in New York and me in Little Rock. And I begged my father and mother not to go back to Germany. And my father said, "Oh, well, Dieter, this will all blow over." So in June of 1938, they returned to Meiningen. In November, they were living next to the synagogue. And Kristallnacht, a large stone building, very impressive synagogue, built in 1885, destroyed, leveled to the ground. My father, along with all the other Jewish men in Meiningen, were arrested and taken to Buchenwald, which was a concentration camp near Meiningen. It's just south of Weimar, between Weimar and Meiningen. Yep.
How long was he in Buchenwald?
Well, in those days, they were not yet killing Jews in concentration camps. And I never really talked to my father about his stay in Buchenwald. He seemed very reluctant to talk about it. And the story that I got is that if you could leave Germany within 24 hours, which he could get on a train and go to his sister in Luxembourg. He had a sister who had a business in Luxembourg. And if you could do that, they would let you go. And my mother was able to pack up furniture. They were able to bring quite a bit of their furniture and belongings with them. So she dealt with the Gestapo and everything that had to be done, filling out the papers, and they were able to leave together. I think they went together to Luxembourg. So they got out of Germany. The question was, what were they going to do? They were not going to be able to stay there in Luxembourg. They didn't take immigrants in from Germany. You couldn't just cross the border and go to Luxembourg. So it turned out, fortunately, that their visitor's visa to the United States was still valid from the year before. So they came to the United States, and my father had a sister living in Cleveland who provided a visa for them. So my immediate family was just super lucky to get out of there.
Before we start with your experiences in the United States, I have a few questions still about Europe, Germany. I want to ask you about saying goodbye to your parents when you left Germany to come to the States. What do you remember about leave taking?
Well, it was painful. Fortunately, I had my brother, my older brother, alongside me, so it wasn't as if I were going by myself into this strange place. I didn't really know how strange it was going to be and what I was going to be facing, but my parents were in good health at that point, and I had been with them all of this time during these difficult months and years and days. It was excruciating for all of us to live under those conditions. So it was a difficult thing to do, to leave them. On the other hand, I realized and recognized full well that if I were to stay, there was no hope of any kind of life. So under those conditions, you muster a kind of attitude and courage that very few people are ever called on to evidence, but many people leave their families today and come to the United States because life in the places where they live is so unsatisfactory and poor. I think that kind of separation, at an age I was, 14 years old, and so I was a young man. I was not a child anymore. I was able to take care of myself, but still required people to help me, but nonetheless, as soon as we possibly could, we reunited in this country. I left Little Rock and came to live with my parents and my brother in Chicago. And so the four of us reestablished a home in Chicago for a number of years.
Before we get to Chicago, I wanted to ask you what you took with you when you left Germany, other than, it sounds like you took your violin.
Yes.
What else did you take with you?
My typewriter and personal belongings, clothing, not knowing anything about climate. I probably overpacked with warm clothes and because Little Rock is a warmer climate than I was used to. So just the usual belongings that
I also wanted to ask you a little bit more about things that happened while you were still in Germany. Do you have any recollections of the Reichstag fire or the Berlin Olympics, any of those big events?
yes, I do. I remember the Reichstag's fire, which was blamed on some young man who I guess belonged to the Communist Party, and he was tried and convicted, and well, within the family we had discussions about these things, and so it was apparent even then that this was probably instigated by the Nazis. I do remember the Olympics, and the one American athlete, can't bring up his name right now, who got, I don't know, several gold medals. And because he was a black, Hitler looked down on him, didn't recognize the extraordinary talent of this runner. I guess he won the 100-meter dash. And the Nuremberg rallies and the speeches that Hitler gave at those rallies that were broadcast on radio very prominently. And Hitler visited our town one time, and people came out, you know, jubilation. One has to remember the hero that he was to the German people. Through 1940, he came back from France, having visited Paris, and gotten the French surrender in the railroad car that was used in World War I to take the total surrender of German forces. He got total surrender of French forces and returned to Berlin and was greeted like a god. It wasn't really until the winter of 41, when German forces were bogged down at the gates of Moscow, that Germans really experienced any kind of military problems. So those years when he held absolute sway in Germany were terrible years for the Jewish people. And I have been back to Meiningen once after the wall came down. And Meiningen was just inside the East German zone, about 5 miles east of the border between East and West Germany. So when I came back, went back to visit with my wife in, I believe it was 1992, the place had been totally neglected during the occupation by the Russians for close to 50 years. And it was not a single Jewish person left in the town. The place where this impressive synagogue had stood was a parking place, disheveled. There was a unremarkable marker, I think just a Star of David, not signifying anything that it had anything to do with. And we also visited the little village where I had been born. That synagogue had been totally destroyed. There were no Jews left there either. And I wrote to the mayor of the town and suggested to him that a more appropriate memorial should be put in place. And my grandson, who went there a few years later, said they had in fact done that. There was now a visible memorial that talked about the synagogue and the Jewish community. But that was it.
I have one more question about pre-war, before you left Germany, before the war started. Since you were one of the last eyewitnesses who can explain this to us, what was it like for you as a young Jew to deal with the propaganda, the Nazi propaganda that was around you? What do you remember from that?
Well, it wasn't just propaganda. It was physical assault, verbal assault, people who would not recognize that you were living there, people who had been friends and neighbors with whom you had conversations, who turned their backs on you, basically. There were places that you could not enter. There were places that you could not visit as a Jew. You felt that you were unwelcome, and that there were no avenues open to earn a living. You couldn't apply for a job and expect to be employed in a Gentile business, and you could not participate in athletic events. You could not use swimming pools or any public places that other people would have access to. You're constantly exposed to the most vicious form of propaganda, so that your life becomes intolerable. And I think it is impossible for people in this country to recognize what this would, or be able to empathize with what this would feel like. I can imagine that a black person has encountered feelings of this sort, and perhaps not to the same degree, but living in Little Rock, I was certainly conscious of the discrimination against black people. I would ride a bus, a streetcar, from my home where I was living to high school. And that streetcar was divided, whites in front, blacks in the rear. You go into a department store, whites would drink from a white marble fountain. Blacks would drink from a black marble. In my uncle's store, all of the salespeople were white. The people who were doing the menial work were black. So I was conscious of that divide. The maid that my aunt hired was a black lady, but she made the most delicious fried chicken that I had never tasted fried chicken before. So I didn't have those feelings about black people, but I can imagine that their lives, and to some extent, they felt that prejudice. And in the South, certainly during the 20s, the Ku Klux Klan was active, and they had to be afraid of their lives. So prejudice was not unique to Germany. Of course, under Hitler, it was more than just he was intent on extermination, and he carried it out in the most brutal and horrible way possible, so that it was a determined and thought out and carried out national policy instituted by him as a national priority.
Is there anything else you wanted to add about your time in Germany? Or do you think we've covered? covered it.
Well, I think that my empathies and feelings for the many, many German Jews who suffered, and other Jews in Poland and in the Baltics and in the rest of Europe under German domination, that to me will always be a part of who I am and what I am, and I am grateful for the blessings that I was able to experience through a series of fortunate circumstances that allowed me personally and my family, my immediate family, to escape that horrible fate.
I wanted to ask you, what were your expectations of the United States and what were your first impressions of the United States?
Well, my first impression was standing on the deck of this ship and sailing past the Statue of Liberty. And that made an indelible impression on me. And I guess I loved this country from that moment on.
When you first got to Little Rock, and then later when you went to Chicago, what adjustments were difficult? Did you speak any English? What was hard?
Well, I had listened to some English records that my parents had bought, and we had a gramophone, a record player, and they played that one record over and over again. And what I remember from it is a man with, of course, a British accent saying, "Cook goes marketing, providing for a family." I remember those words, but I didn't speak any English at all when I came to Little Rock. And when we were met at the pier by relatives in New York, they took us to Horn and Hardet's what did they call it? Horn and Hardet. You go in there and you open a little door and there's food in back, and you take the food out and you take it to a table. Automat. A Horn and Hardet automat. And you take the food out, whether it's, some meat or vegetable or pie or something. And I guess I was hungry and I kept taking the food out, and I thought, what a wonderful country. You walk into a place, you open a door and you take out the food. Of course, it didn't occur to me to pay for it, but the people who met me paid for it. I thought this was all free. I had a marvelous impression of this country. The food is free. You walk in, take your food. So I didn't speak English at all. And when I got to Little Rock, high school began right after Labor Day, so I had just a month, really, to become acclimated. And my Aunt Hetty, she wasn't a real aunt, but she was a first cousin to my mother, whatever that makes her. And she had come from Germany. She came to this country when she was a girl, and she spoke English without an accent. And she helped me very much with my pronunciation. She would correct my pronunciation. She had a little bit of a southern accent, but I didn't acquire that somehow, I don't think. But she helped me with pronunciation and with the language. And I started school on Labor Day. And I don't know how this happened, but I guess I must have talked to the principal of the high school, and they decided on the basis of the courses that I'd had in Germany and I don't know how they reached that judgment. They put me ahead. I was put into the 10th grade, into the 11th grade. I only had 2 years of high school. I graduated high school at 16. And I remember the first assignment that we got in English class. The teacher, English teacher, she said, well, we're going to study Idyls of the King, Tennyson. Tennyson's Idyls of the King. You go down to the bookstore and you get a copy of Idyls of the King. I don't know what the hell she was talking about, Idyls of the King. But I went there and I got the book. And one of the things we were required to do was to memorize 200 lines of poetry. Little Rock High School English class. And I did. And I remember it to this day. Leodogran, the king of Camelard, had one fair daughter and none other child, and she was fairest of all flesh on earth, and Guinevere, and in her his one delight. And many a petty king ere Arthur came, ruled in this land, etc., etc. Yeah, I learned some of that, and Milton and Shakespeare. And I guess I got the highest grade in English at the end of the first semester. I guess I liked English. I still do. Of all the languages I speak it in English the best.
When you came to Little Rock in the South, did you experience any anti-Semitic or any anti-foreign sentiments?
I did not. That is, to me, that was the most remarkable thing. That even though my English was still somewhat halting, I never had a single remark by any of the students, not one. Amazing, really.
A little while ago, you were talking about Kristallnacht and what happened to your father. You were already in the States. How did you hear about the events of Kristallnacht?
Well, the newspapers, and the fact that I had no contact with my parents for more than a month. I didn't know what to do. I mean, we didn't have telephones, and we didn't have cell phones. You couldn't reach them except by mail. And I wrote to them. I didn't get a reply. I was getting very worried until I finally did get a letter from them.
And you also mentioned a little while ago that you went from Little Rock to Chicago. How did Little Rock compare to Chicago?
How did it compare?
How did it compare? You had just come from Little Rock, and then all of a sudden you're in Chicago.
Yeah. Well, Little Rock in those days was still kind of sleepy, quiet, but Little Rock was the state capital, the Capitol building. And Little Rock is quite impressive. And Main Street was at business. Little Rock in those days was about maybe 100,000 people, so it was a good-sized town, and had a sizable Jewish community, and a very impressive synagogue, and Rabbi Sanders, who had been to Union Theological Seminary. I mean, he was the leader of the congregation. In fact, he asked me to teach Hebrew in Sunday school, so I did that for a while. The little Hebrew that I knew, I guess I knew more than the kids did here. So Little Rock was, but in Chicago, my father was very active in founding a temple, a synagogue for Jewish refugees in Chicago. It's called Temple Ezra. And it's still going. I think it has merged with another congregation, but he was one of the founders of Temple Ezra in Chicago and was active during religious holidays in conducting services. They were renting a church in Uptown District of Chicago, but that was not large enough for the holidays. And so they used the People's Church that had been started by Preston Bradley, who was a very well-known Chicago personality, a preacher. Preston Bradley, a very progressive man who started the People's Church. And that was quite an impressive building. It's still standing as far as I know. And the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services were held by Temple Ezra in this People's Church every year. And I would attend for a number of years. I would go there and attend my services led by my father in Chicago. So he continued his cantorial services in Chicago when he got here.
Were your parents able to get well, you mentioned your father did the cantorial work. Was he able to get other employment in Chicago, or was that sufficient?
Well, that wasn't sufficient. He got a job as a carpenter in a shop that built toolboxes under a defense contract. This would have been, well, they came to Chicago at the beginning of 1939. The war began the war in Europe began in the fall of 1939, but I think this country, under Roosevelt, there was already, even before Pearl Harbor, there were, businesses were getting contracts with the War Department, or Defense Department, what it was called. So this guy was building toolboxes, wooden toolboxes. And my father, as you can see here, his hobby was wood carving. He made this music stand for my mother, who was a pianist, intricate wood carving, and that was sort of his hobby when he was younger. And so he knew how to use wood tools, and he got a job at this cabinet maker, toolbox maker, in Chicago. So he was able to do that, and my mother was, she had learned how to use a sewing machine as, as a housewife. So she got a job in Chicago sewing dresses in a sweatshop. And she joined the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, as a sewing machine operator. So they both did that. And my brother had a job in the hotel business. So we were living in a small apartment on Winnemac Street, Winnemac Avenue, 5000 North in the Uptown District in Chicago. And it was not luxurious living. We all worked very hard. And
What were you doing?
well, I had no skills. I got jobs in a again sort of connected to this was a molding machine business. They had molding machines. You put in plastic, let's say polyethylene or whatnot, and you heat it up, and a plunger pushes the molten plastic into a mold, a very precisely machined mold to make fountain pens, lipstick casings, whatnot. And you have to operate this mold. This was only partially automatic. The mold would close, and then the plastic would solidify as it was cooling, and then the mold would open, and you would have to take the molded plastic out of the machine and not leave it in there because it would close automatically. And if you left the plastic in there, it would damage the mold. So you have to watch it very carefully and pay attention. So you did that. It was a routine automatic job that you have to attend to. And you do that for 8 hours. And in this particular shop, you'd work for 3 months a morning shift. Then you switch to an afternoon shift. Then you switch to a night shift. And you're changing your sleeping schedule every month. So it's kind of hard. I don't know why they did that, but they did. And I did that for several months. And then I worked in a machine shop, and I was at a milling machine that was making stitching needles for mattresses on Ohio Street. So I was operating a milling machine, and it was, by that time, it was on Ohio Street, and so I started going to night school classes at Northwestern University, which was just a few blocks away. So I worked during the day, and I took chemistry classes at night there. In the, they offered beginning chemistry in the evening, and I got to know the professor, Leonard Fosdick, who became my first scientific mentor. I guess he was a cousin of Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was a famous preacher in New York. But anyway, he said, Dieter, if you want to get a degree in chemistry, you won't do it at night school. You have to go up to the Evanston campus and go to day school. And they will give you a scholarship. So that's what I did. I went up there, and I had never been to that campus. I didn't know where I was going, and I walked in a door, turned out to be the chairman of the chemical engineering department at Northwestern. And I said, I'd like to go to school, but I would need a scholarship. He said, well, are you Jewish? I said, yes. He said, we don't give scholarships to Jewish students. And I'll tell you why. It's because our students go to school for 3 months, and then they work in industry at some industrial company for 3 months. And these companies don't want to take our Jewish students because they say they learn everything about our business and then they start their own business and go into competition with us. But he said, you go down Sheridan Road to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and they will give you a scholarship. So I did that, and they gave me a scholarship. So I was able to complete my studies.
I want to ask you what happened next, but I also want to find out, you were here in the United States when Germany attacked Poland and the war started. And I wanted to see, your reflections on how that was presented in the news here, and what was the reaction of the American people?
Well, that's interesting. I said my parents came here in April of 1939. And I graduated from Little Rock High School in June of 1939. And I got on a bus and came up to Chicago. And I spent the summer with my parents and went back to Little Rock on a bus. And I went back on a bus that stopped somewhere between Illinois and, southern Illinois, either borders or very close to the border of Arkansas. It would stop there, and it was maybe 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, and the radio was on, and it said, Germany invaded Poland, England has declared war. I learned it on a bus from Chicago to Little Rock. So at that time, since the United States was not involved, it did not really make a huge impression on the American public. I mean, it found its way into the papers, and the papers were following it and discussing it, but people by and large didn't really pay that much attention to it, as far as I could tell. So that was not really a topic, at least in the circles that I traveled in.
Did you follow the progress of the war? Perhaps more than your American friends?
Well, I did, because it was clear that the European Jews in all of Europe would now be affected, and Poland in particular. And so when news, came out about Hitler's march into Warsaw and things that were going on there, became clear that he was going to carry out his policies in Poland and in France. In France in particular, and certainly in Luxembourg, and that was a family concern, because my aunt, who lived in Luxembourg, had a business, a very successful business in Luxembourg. She had to leave. She left Luxembourg, came to New York, and we had a daughter of a brother of my father's who had married a man who was French, and she lived in Metz. And so there was concern in the family about our relatives in Luxembourg and France, and obviously in the rest of Europe. We were certainly aware of what was going to happen. whenever the Germans would occupy a country. The Jews there would be under extreme duress. And my father was particularly conscious of all of that. I mean, he eventually, not immediately, but in the spring of 1940, the Germans marched into France, and my father would follow that very closely because he knew many of the localities that they were talking about in the news. And that became even more obvious to me when after Hitler invaded Russia, because he would listen to Kaltenborn, who was a newspaper commentator in those days, a very well-known commentator, Kaltenborn, Hans von Kaltenborn. He had a heavy German accent, but he would talk about the various locations, towns that the Germans were overrunning in Russia, Ukraine. My father occupied Kiev before the Germans got to Kiev in World War I. So he would follow the various battles and locations that were being talked about on the radio. And he had familiarity with Russia that I didn't have. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he seemed to be quite knowledgeable about what the Germans were doing in those early months of the war. But that wasn't until 41. In 39, when, he didn't march into, he occupied Poland, and then it stopped. I mean, they had come to an agreement with the Russians, a non-aggression pact that von Ribbentrop and the Russian foreign minister had signed in I think 1940 perhaps, but anyway, he occupied half of Poland. The Russians occupied the other half, and then they stopped. They didn't go any further. Until 41. So during that period of September of 39, during that fall and spring, there wasn't very much going on in Europe. Hitler had failed to he had launched a bombing campaign against England, which was repulsed by the RAF. And that was a very important point in the war, that the British were able to counter Hitler from, if he had succeeded in defeating the British Air Force, he would have been able to invade England, and the war would have been a totally different thing. But the beginning stages, 39, In retrospect, of course, it's a totally different thing. But at the time, because the U.S. was not involved, it was discussed, of course, and in the Jewish community it was more significant than in many other places. We didn't have the commercial interactions that we have today. That really did not develop until after World War II, the globalization of trade and so on and so forth. There was some, but not nearly what it is today. And so the connections with Europe were much more tenuous than they are now.
When did you get your BA from Northwestern? What year was that? What year was that?
My bachelor's degree?
Yes.
My undergraduate degree I got in June of '44.
And what did you do after you got your degree?
After I got my degree, I went to Oak Ridge, Tennessee to work on the Manhattan Project.
How did that happen, that transition?
Well, I was during that period when I was at Northwestern as an undergraduate, I became closely associated with a young professor on the faculty there by the name of Irving M. Klotz, K-L-O-T-Z, who was the first Jewish professor in the chemistry department at Northwestern. And he was a Chicago boy, born and bred. He got his degree at the University of Chicago. And had been at Northwestern for just 2 or 3 years before I got there. He was in his maybe 27, 28, young professor whom I worked with, and we did a research program on trying to understand the mechanism of action of a new class of drugs that had been discovered in Germany but had antibacterial properties. Today we know them as the sulfate drugs. And the outstanding example was sulfanilamide, which is it's not an antibiotic, but it's a powerful antimicrobial active against infectious diseases. Was used during the early stages of World War II. Soldiers, American soldiers, British soldiers who were wounded on the battlefield before penicillin became widely available. The sulfate drugs, and they're still being used. Irving Klotz wanted to understand how they worked, what was the mechanism by means of which they could kill bacteria. And so he had a research program funded by Abbott Labs. And I worked with him on that project using latest tools that had been developed at that time, which were spectrophotometers, and Beckman was Beckman spectrophotometer I used to measure the spectra of various compounds, some of which were available commercially, some of which we synthesized in the laboratory. And I worked on this. I mean, I took a full load of coursework, but then found time in my spare time to do research. And we got enough data to prepare a paper which actually was published during the war still, and Journal of the American Chemical Society. But Irving and I became quite friendly, and he was one of the first to apply thermodynamic principles to biological problems. Biological chemistry, biochemistry was really what we were doing, trying to understand mechanism of action of a drug. It's really a biochemical problem, and he applied thermodynamic principles to this problem. And he said, Dieter, there is a recruiter here from this project, and he would like to talk to you. And so I had an interview with this guy, and he said, we need you yesterday. So I got on a train and went down there.
What did you know about the nature of what was going down with the Manhattan Project?
Before I went down there,
Yes.
nothing. He didn't tell me
How long did
anything.
it take me to figure it out?
Well, I went down there, and it was September, and I stayed overnight in Knoxville and then took a bus to Oak Ridge, and I got off the bus, and I was essentially ankle deep in mud. The place is just, was farmland. Had just been cleared and was being converted overnight into a project. And so I stayed in a dormitory, large wooden structure, West Village 54. And then I got to the place there where I was supposed to work, and I said, well, I would like to be in a research part rather than the production part. So they put me into the chemistry division, which the head of it was a man by the name of Clarence Larson. Clarence Larson came from California, and after the war he became director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So he was was quite a good administrator, and he said, Dieter, you know what we're working on? I said, no, I don't. So I'll show you. He went into his office, and he had a safe. He opened the safe, and there was a handbook of physics and chemistry, and he opened it up to the periodic table, and he said, this is what we're working on. He pointed to uranium. He says, but you must not say uranium. You have to use tube alloy. That was the code name, tube alloy. The British had used that term, so that was being used, and that was it. We worked on tube alloy.
Can you tell us about your experience working on the Manhattan Project? I should probably ask you to please clarify for the audience what the Manhattan Project was.
The Manhattan Project was the place where the atom bombs were developed. And there were two separate parts. One was the uranium part, one was the plutonium part. Uranium was an element that was very well known, very well studied. You get it from the ground, you can mine it. We have it in this country. A lot of it during the war came from the Belgian Congo. But it's found in many different places, and you can get it out of the ground and mine it and refine it, and you can make uranium compounds, you can make uranium metal. Now, uranium metal has to be, uranium has two isotopes, uranium-238, 235. 235 is the fissionable isotope, and one must separate it from uranium-238 in order to make a bomb. And that is what Oak Ridge was tasked to do, to separate kilogram quantities of uranium-235 present in the ore in less than 1%. So the technical challenge is to do that. And that's what we were to do. When I came down there in September of 1944, there wasn't a milligram of 235 available. The place was in uproar because the magnets of the caleutrons, which were the huge machines used, mass spectrometers used to separate uranium-235, had short-circuited, had burned out, and had to be shipped back for Allis-Chalmers to be repaired. And they had just come back and were being reassembled. And we were just going back into production. So between September of 1944 and April of 1945, we separated of the order of 60 kilograms of weapons grade 235, which was then shipped to Los Alamos laboratory headed by a man by the name of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and assembled into a bomb, which became the Hiroshima bomb.
Did you have any misgivings about this work?
Not when I was doing it, no. Because, in part, fission had been discovered in Germany in December of 1938. See, the dates are very important here, because unless you can be aware of the timing of all of this, you don't appreciate the import of this project, which there is a very, I think, important series of episodes on Netflix. I think there's 6 episodes that are called Turning Point. And the subtitle is The Atomic Bomb and the Effect on the Cold War. Anyone who's interested in this period in history would be interested in seeing those episodes. They're very well done and quite factual. So it's a long, complicated story, which we're still living with. The after effects are still with us, and it is a turning point in world history, the development of nuclear weapons. So at that time, at Oak Ridge, I knew that fission had been discovered in Germany, as I said, in 1938, at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where Albert Einstein had been professor, but he had long left. But there were German scientists left, including Lise Meitner, who worked with the man who discovered fission, but had left by that time because she was Jewish, gone to Sweden. So we knew that Germany knew about fission, and how long would it be before they would have nuclear weapons? And that was to be prevented. And so it was important to do that.
Would you like to take a break for a few minutes and we'll
Yeah.
finish up after
Let's do
a
that.
short break?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are rolling.
Okay, we're back. And I wanted to ask, after the bombs were deployed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how did you and your colleagues feel about what had just happened and what the future of atomic weapons might be?
Well, I think many of the scientists who worked on the project recognized that nuclear weapons must never be used again in warfare. And so there was, I would say, a movement among scientists who worked on the project to find ways in which that might be done. And so the various labs, like Oak Ridge, University of Chicago, where the first chain reaction was built by Fermi and his collaborators, at Los Alamos, where the bombs were put together, and at Berkeley, where there were a group of scientists who, for example, put together the Calutron, the machines that separated the uranium isotopes, and also Glenn Seaborg, who was at Berkeley and discovered plutonium, the other fissionable element, plutonium-239, which was used in the Nagasaki bomb. So scientists in all those laboratories formed organizations. At Oak Ridge, we formed the Oak Ridge Scientists and Engineers, and we had meetings during the week, which we voiced our concerns about nuclear weapons and wanted to make sure that these could be controlled and not used in warfare. And how was this to be done? So there was a group of us at Oak Ridge that got together, the 3 colleagues and myself. We composed a letter addressed to, we sent it to about 150 outstanding people in science and politics and in the arts and media and business, and we got about 100 replies, including one from Albert Einstein, who said, well, the only way we can be sure that these weapons will not be used again in warfare would be if we have a world government. That was the only way to do it. A world government. Well, those correspondences, eventually we decided to give them to the Regenstein Library at the University of Chicago, and that's where they reside in their special collection. And this letter from Einstein was actually on exhibit on the 75th anniversary of the founding of the anniversary of the nuclear chain reaction. I think they had an exhibit at the Regenstein in a commemoration of that event. So anyone who's interested can go look at that letter and read it. So there was considerable interest, and still is. And the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which is still being published, Rachel Bronson is the editor, deals with these subjects and also global warming and other issues of concern for everybody. That bulletin grew out of these initial activities of scientists associated with the Manhattan Project.
Is there anything more you want to tell us about your days at Oak Ridge?
Well, I think what made a lasting impression on me that I've carried with me ever since is the capacity of this country to do whatever it wants to do and do it efficiently and quickly. And it's a lesson that a lot of people who haven't had this experience cannot possibly appreciate. In the world of today, we need a Manhattan Project like that. where the nation comes together and is united and is behind solving a national problem. I think that is an experience that I carry away from my days there. It's one that I would like to see repeated somehow to deal with climate problem. And you are experiencing a very extreme events which are not going to go away, and we have to deal with them. And I think we can only do it together in a united effort.
We can talk about climate science in just a minute. I have to ask you where you went after you left Oak Ridge. What happened next?
Well, I left Oak Ridge in April of 1946. So the war in Japan was over in early September of 45. And I went back to Northwestern and continued working with Irving Klotz and got a master's degree at Northwestern. And in 1947, I decided to really continue work more along the lines that I had experienced at Oak Ridge. I had become interested in the new elements that were being discovered at what was then the end of the periodic table. And that work was being pursued at the Argonne National Laboratory that was established just about April of 1946. So in 47, I left Northwestern and went down to the Argonne lab and the university. At that time, the Argonne National Lab was still on the campus of the University of Chicago. And so I began to take graduate courses in the chemistry department at the University of Chicago with the goal of getting a PhD. Mm-hmm.
And what happened in your life next? So you went from Evanston to Hyde Park, and you are working on your PhD. What did you do after you got your PhD?
Well, I got my PhD in that problem that I had become interested in, the electronic structure of the actinide elements that were being discovered and had to find a place in the periodic table. There was a question where they would fit, whether they would be a 6D series or a 5F series, and there was a scientific problem to be solved with regard to the electronic structure of these elements. And I contributed to that with my PhD dissertation. When I finished the work for the dissertation was about the time that the laboratory moved from its location on the campus of the university to a new campus or a new site west of Chicago on a large tract of land that the laboratory acquired and built a new campus, much larger and with a much enhanced program. The programmatic aspect of this national laboratory was to develop nuclear power reactors, to make nuclear power, that is electricity created by using the heat that accompanies the fission process in a controlled way to heat water, to make steam, and to make electricity by steam turning a turbine. So that was the hope, that nuclear power could provide a source, an abundant source of electricity for this country and for the world. And so it was the primary task of the Argonne Lab to exploit this newfound technology for making electricity, energy, economically inexpensive, and to develop the reactors, the materials, and the techniques and the technologies required to do that. And this large facility, which is still in existence, was built, and the staff was transferred to work out here in this new laboratory. And how to get from Hyde Park to the western suburbs means a carpool. There was no public transportation. So we formed carpools, and for 3 years I commuted from Hyde Park to the Argonne by carpool before ultimately moving to Downers Grove and coming to live here. So my career, my scientific career, has been entirely as a scientist working at the Argonne National Laboratory.
This new research, nuclear power research, is this under civilian or military control? Can you clarify that? And
Well, it's a very, very good question, because obviously the first fruits, if you like, of that Manhattan Project were weapons, and those And the top man in charge of the project was a general, General Leslie R. Groves. And he picked J. Robert Oppenheimer to lead the Los Alamos laboratory. But at the end of the war, Groves came to Oak Ridge and gave a speech to the troops, us, the staff, expressing his appreciation, etc., etc. And then the question was, should this atomic nuclear effort be under the military or under civilian control? And there were two bills. One was introduced into the House of Representatives, was called the, that bill would, I think it was called the May bill, would have placed nuclear power under military control. The Senate bill was the McMahon bill. Senator McMahon introduced a bill in the Senate that would give control to the civilian control. And I was active in this Oak Ridge Engineers and Scientists organization. I would get the transcripts of the congressional hearings in Washington on both of those bills every day, and I would condense them into a newspaper article and drive it from Oak Ridge to Knoxville, I think it was called the Knoxville Sentinel daily newspaper in Knoxville, and they would print it. So people were reading the transcripts of the congressional hearings on what to do with nuclear power in Knoxville in the paper every day, articles that I had put together. The McMahon bill won, and so the national laboratories, which now Brookhaven, well, that came later, Oak Ridge, Argonne, Los Alamos, Berkeley, and of course now we have Livermore. These are all under civilian control, and they're today part of the Department of Energy. So they all report ultimately to the Cabinet Secretary, the Secretary of Energy, who is in Washington and presides over the Department of Energy. But originally, it was not a department. It was the Atomic Energy Commission for a number of years, and there were chairmen of the Atomic Energy Commission, Lilienthal, and Strauss, I think, was chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission for a time. Strauss, who was sort of major domo during the Oppenheimer hearings, and Seaborg was chairman for about 10 years. And then it became a department, a separate department with an energy secretary. So that's what it is today. And the Argonne is under that setup, is being is part of the Department of Energy, gets its funding through Congress and through the Department of Energy, and is administered by the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago has, from the very beginning, administered the Argonne National Laboratory. So they have the administrative control. They're involved in choosing the director of the Argonne National Laboratory. And they have a vice president of the University of Chicago who is vice president for Argonne. His major responsibility, as far as the university is concerned, is to the president of the university to inform him about affairs at Argonne. He is delegated by the University of Chicago responsibility for Argonne, ultimately to the Department of Energy. So that's the administrative chain. And Argonne employs about 3,000 people, maybe half are scientists and engineers, maybe somewhat more than half. But its activities today are centered in areas other than nuclear reactors, because the idea of nuclear reactors becoming a large and growing segment of the U.S. National electricity grid has not really worked out for a variety of reasons.
You had mentioned a few minutes ago about not using nuclear energy in war. Did you do any work with this kind of energy with the military in any capacity in your career?
Well, during the war,
No, I mean, okay, after the war, did you do anything with nuclear power with any of the branches of the military?
not directly with the military and not under military supervision, but I did work in the very beginning on an important problem related to the nuclear submarine, which was a development that was undertaken by Captain I'll have to. His name
Are you
will
talking
come
about
to me.
Rick Heimer? Rickover?
Rickover.
I mean,
Hyman
I'm sorry.
G. Rickover. Thank you. Yes, and he was a very aggressive and very determined man who felt that a nuclear submarine was absolutely required, and he pushed it through. And there was a problem that I helped that I worked on, and my solution worked, but it was not ultimately the one that was adopted. There was another one that has become the commercial successor, but it produced the desired result, and the end product, which is hafnium-free zirconium, still being used as cladding for the fuel elements. And nuclear submarines today are among the chief nuclear shields that are very powerful weapons.
One more question on this general topic, and then I have just a few more after that. What would you like people in the future to understand about some of the people you work, some of the projects you worked on and some of the names that we've mentioned? We mentioned Oppenheimer, we've mentioned Rickover. What should people in the future understand about this period of time and your experience? What can you share about this?
Well, we have to remember that fission, that discovery, gave rise to the most frightful weapon man has ever devised. It is so powerful. Today, nuclear bombs are 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. We cannot imagine the power, and we cannot imagine the destruction a single hydrogen bomb can cause. The few can be the end of this country, in fact. So this whole development is only is 80 years old. It is recent by human experience. We have not had to come to terms with any change of this magnitude in our way of life ever. And our civilization goes back 4,000 or 5,000 years. Things have been much more gradual. Now we are facing an enormous change, and it is a grave danger to all of humanity to live with nuclear weapons. And particularly today, when there can be accidents, and they can result in misunderstandings. We are not facing up to the dangers that face all of us. That will be too late if we don't do something about it, and we must do something about it. That's my feeling.
We have some unfinished business I need to ask you about. When did you first realize the scope of the genocide during World War II? When did it dawn on you? And also, what happened to family and friends left behind?
Well, when did it dawn on me that what?
The scope of the genocide. People talk about the 6 million. When did you realize the number of Jewish victims was that big?
Well, I think one of the pictures that is in my mind is the visit that General Eisenhower paid to, I think, there was a concentration camp near Munich, and that was the time when the real horror of the thing was made very clear. There had really been no pictures, no visual, and it's only when you can see the images that the totality of it really hits you. And I think that shortly after the war in Europe ended and some of these visual images came to public attention, that one had a really overview of the magnitude of what had been done.
What happened to your family and friends left behind? Who survived, who didn't, of those who were left in Europe?
Well, very few of the people that I knew in Waldorf or Meiningen survived. And the individual fate is not known to me. And I think it would take very heroic efforts on my part to find out what happened to each one individually. I think that most of them just disappeared in concentration camps.
How closely did you follow the Nuremberg trials?
The Nuremberg trials.
How closely did you follow them?
Well, how closely did I follow them? Well, I'm not familiar in detail with all of the proceedings, but the major figures who were dealt with, I think justifiably so.
Did you follow the UN debate about the partition of Palestine? Is that something that you paid attention to?
Well, the state of Israel was declared when I was on my honeymoon in 1948. And I remember we were at the YMCA conference grounds in the Rocky Mountains, my wife and I. And there was a man there who had been an official at the Jerusalem YMCA. And I got into a debate with him about Israel. He was very upset that that Jerusalem, at least the YMCA in Jerusalem, was in Israeli hands. YMCA in Jerusalem, not too far from the King David Hotel, is not in the old city. I think that the partition was Israel beat back all the Arab countries invaded Israel when Ben Gurion declared independence. And Israel managed to hold out and establish the state. It's, I think, a miracle that without really any prior military experience, they were able to hold out against Arab forces to the extent they did. But of course, we're not allowed to enter the old city. And I think that situation today is a reflection of political forces that have been in existence, but they have to be reckoned with. What can we do?
I assume in order to work on the Manhattan Project, you had to be an American citizen? Did you have to be a US citizen to work on the Manhattan Project?
No, you didn't.
Are you an American citizen?
Am I
Yes,
an American citizen?
yes.
I became an American citizen as soon as I possibly could.
What does it mean to you to be an American citizen? You talked a little bit about it very early on when you talked about the Statue of Liberty. But what is it like for you, given your childhood? What's it like to be an American?
It's by far the greatest country in the world that I know about. And it is the one country that I would give my life to protect. And why? Because it is the place where I can say what I want to say, where I can think what I want to think, and where more and more people are free to express themselves in every way that makes life worth living. And for me, it has been salvation. And it's a fantastic place. And we got to keep it that way. We got a lot of work ahead of us to keep it that way.
October 7th. Can you tell us about your reaction and also your thoughts about the rise in anti-Semitism here and globally?
Well, there Billy Carter was the brother of Jimmy Carter, said, "There's more Arabs than there's Jews." He's right. And they think it's their country, and we are occupying it. Well, Jews have lived there for a long, long time, since the days of Abraham. And I think that following what Hitler did, I think that the Jews are justified to have a state. The details of the politics, I don't know. I'm not a citizen of Israel. I don't know how to judge the various factions, but there should be a Jewish state. I think that the attacks aimed at destroying Israel should be met with resistance by the Israelis, as they are. And I just hope that reason will prevail and the sides will come to an agreement and settle down and learn to live together and create a fruitful area of the world instead of a fractious one.
I want to ask you about the work that you're doing now and a comment that you said to me about a year ago. You said that humanity faces two existential threats. I'd like you to explain that. I was listening.
Well, yes, you were. And your questions are excellent, and I congratulate you on the quality of your questions. And I appreciate your persistence in keeping after me. I very much appreciate that. And I do hope at some point we can meet and have a cup of coffee or something together. What do I mean by existential threat? I think it's clear to me that nuclear weapons are an existential threat to humanity. They are so powerful, and their after effects, destructive effects when they explode, are so horrible that we're lucky that we have survived for for 75 years after they were first used and not have been used again, and now there are people in this world who are openly talking about using nuclear weapons in war. In my opinion, if you use a nuclear weapon, so-called tactical nuclear weapons, it will escalate into a nuclear war. And that would be the end of humanity, in my opinion. the other existential threat is climate change. Again, I believe, and it's my opinion, I don't know what other people think, that we are responsible for climate change because of the hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 that we have put into the atmosphere. And it is clear from many pieces of evidence that CO2 acts as a greenhouse gas. It prevents a certain region of infrared radiation from being re-emitted into space, keeping the planet at a reasonable temperature by CO2. And the Industrial Revolution, or the society that we have built that has used fossil fuels for the greatest production of the energy that we all use and need, is responsible for that. And when the temperature and humidity, the temperature-humidity index exceeds a certain level, you cannot live anymore under those conditions. And the only way to cure this problem is to get together again on a global scale. We need to find within ourselves, and very quickly, the capacity to get together and talk about what to do about this. And we've got to do it. If we don't, things just are going to get worse. We have to get together and do it. I'm expressing my opinions. Other people will disagree with them, and I can't help that. So I'm only doing what my background and what I know about things lead me to believe, but you can't be certain that you're correct. But I think those two areas have to be dealt with. If we don't, and as human beings, we know how to think. We know that we're rational human beings. We can figure things out. We can find answers. And these answers are to questions that are so large that no individual and no individual country and no individual continent can solve it, because climate is global. It is set by the atmosphere. The atmosphere around Earth is a very thin, tenuous layer of gas. Gas. It envelops the whole planet. There is no other planet that has this kind of atmosphere that I know of. We can live here, and we have to keep it the way it is. And we have to get together and make sure that it will take a lot of things and sacrifice on the part of everyone to do that. Somehow we've got to find the way to do it, or suffer the consequences. That's my message.
Oh, well, I haven't even asked you yet the message, but I wanted to ask you, what would you like your legacy to be?
What would I what?
What would you like your legacy?
My legacy. My legacy. You know, everybody wants to contribute something. And what can I contribute? The only thing I have is the little bit of stuff I know about how nature works. And it seems to me that we are here on this earth because a large factor in our being here is due to the fact that we have the sun as an energy source. And the sun gets its energy from a nuclear process called fusion, which is the opposite of fission. Nuclei come together at a high temperature and pressure and form higher elements and create energy, a tremendous amount of energy.
Sorry, guys, I gotta stop for a second. 3, 2, 1.
Okay, I had asked you what you want your legacy to be, and you were talking about the sun. Can you continue where you left off?
Well, let's think about this for a minute. It's something that should be taught in kindergarten or before. The enormous power output, the energy output of the sun, it's inconceivable. And we only get a very tiny fraction of it. But the amount of energy that we get from the sun is enough in 1 hour to provide all of the energy all of us use in a year. So that is the resource that we have. Now, the reason we can live the way we do, you have 117 degrees outside in Vegas, and you turn on your air conditioning, and it's not so bad. But you're using electricity in order to cool your room. Now multiply that by a few billion air conditioners, and you get the amount of energy that is required to keep everyone comfortable. Well, where does that energy come from? It comes from what we call fossil fuels: coal, oil, gas. Why do we call them fossil fuels? What are the fossils that they come from? They are fossils of plants and some animals, but mostly plants that grew hundreds of millions of years ago on this earth, and that grew and died and went into the ground and became fossilized. And coal is a rock made out of carbon from plants that grew for 100 million years to make coal deposits and oil deposits and gas deposits. That's the fossil fuel. So they represent energy from the sun that through photosynthesis was converted to chemical bond energy to grow the trunks and branches and leaves of trees, went into the ground, and took 100 million years to accumulate. And we're burning it all up in 100 or 200 years. So we have to learn to use the sun's energy directly, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. Well, a lot of people are doing that by putting silicon solar cells on their roofs and making energy by converting light directly into electricity. And that is a development that's really magic. You have light and you have a material, you shine light on it, and you take two wires and you have electricity. So we can do that, and we're doing it today on a fairly large scale. But in order to do what we have to do in order to eliminate climate change, is we have to do this on a scale that is hundreds of times larger than we do today. And that is going to be very difficult to do using silicon solar cells. It's not clear that it can be done using silicon solar cells that are inefficient. That is, they convert only 15 to 20% of the energy in the light to electricity. And we can do much better than that. Theoretically, we can do up to 86%. So there is a premium on developing more efficient solar cells in order to, and they have to be cheap, like silicon. So that's going to require a very substantial scientific and technical and engineering effort. In my opinion, it can only be done by a lot of people coming together and deciding that we have to do this, and then doing it and building plants and grids in a hurry, because if we don't do it in the next few years, you see what is happening. We have to do it, I think. So it may sound preachy, but I don't know any other way. Maybe somebody will come along and bring some magic solution, but I think it's something that we have to decide to do. Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
You're very welcome.
What are we looking at?
This is
Peter, what's this?
a violin made by, it's a Koch violin. I believe they're still being made, but this one was made very close to the year of my birth. And it's the one on which the violin teacher by the name of Koch, no relation. I have his picture here. Gave me lessons.
And the initials, they stand for?
Well, violin. The name of the maker is Professor F. J. Koch, made in Dresden.
In Germany, and then those are your initials. Can you please give us your name?
Whose name?
Your name.
My name is Dieter Gruen.
So those are your initials. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Rolling. Ready?
Yep.
Anytime. You want to ask him something?
Did you give me the heads up?
Yeah, I said we're rolling.
I'm sorry.
That's cool.
Can you please tell us, who is this?
This is my wife, Dolores Gruen.
And when was it taken?
That was taken in 1941.
Where was it taken?
In Toledo, Ohio.
And is there some significance to the frame?
The frame was carved by my father, Joseph Gruen.
And do you know when? Was it carved for this photo?
No, it was not carved for this photo. It was carved as an engagement present with my mother, and that would have been 1912.
And where was it made?
It was
What
made
country?
in Germany.
And your name, sir?
Dieter Gruen.
Thank you.
All right, we are rolling.
Who is this?
This is my father, Joseph Grunstein, during World War I.
Do you know where it was taken?
I do not. It was taken in Germany.
And your name, sir?
Dieter Gruen.
Thank you.
Okay, we are rolling.
And who is this?
This is Rabbiner Moses Epstein, my great-great-grandfather.
Do you know when and where this was taken?
It was taken in 1856 in Schwarza, Germany.
And your name, sir?
Dieter Gruen.
Thank you.
And roll camera whenever you're ready.
You can get it from there.
Okay.
What are we looking at? What is this?
It is a music stand for holding sheet music.
And what is the significance of this?
It was hand carved as an engagement present by my father for my mother.
Can
She
you give
was
me
a
their first and
she
last
was a
names?
pianist.
And their names, please?
My mother's name was Meta Grünstein. My father's name was Joseph Grünstein.
And do you know when it was made?
In 1912
And where it was made?
in Waldorf, Germany.
And your name, sir?
Dieter Gruen.
Thank you very much, and this now concludes the interview.